Right now, we're looking at the prehistory of the Great Pirate Era. Even the World Economic Journal, as shown in Shonen Jump, described it that way. This flashback mainly focuses on the movements of the Rocks Pirates and Roger Pirates, but some of you may have noticed something very different compared to Luffy's time. There's no mention of the Yonkos. In today's One Piece world, it's said that to survive in the New World, you either have to challenge the emperors or serve under them. They're that important. So then, why didn't such figures exist 40 years ago? In this video, we're going to break down the entire balance of power in One Piece. I'll show you when the four emperors first emerged and identify the very first four pirates who were given that title. And honestly, with the way the story's been developing lately, I think the truth behind this could be revealed very soon. That's why I rushed to make this video now. So tell me, who do you think were the original Yonko? By the way, I recently asked you to send in your questions for the SBS, and I've picked out some of the most popular ones. Check the pinned comment, you'll see them there. The ones with the most likes, I actually plan to send directly to Oda Sensei. And surprisingly, a lot of the theories I talked about in the past have actually started coming true in the main story lately. Since it's been over 2 years since I started this channel, I think there are now plenty of well-aged videos here. So take this chance to check them out. They might even give you some ideas for building your own theories. And I also do this kind of interactive communication on my Patreon. Over there, we have discussions on your question topics, plus in-depth content every week, including translations of the latest One Piece chapters from a native Japanese perspective. I keep the number of members limited each month so it stays personal. So if you'd like to connect more deeply, feel free to check out my page. So, when do you think the idea of the Yonko actually came about? In Loki's flashback, about 40 years ago, that era was called the Age of Rocks. But there's no sign that anyone back then was seen as Yonko. There's no clear statement in the story yet, but I believe the concept of the Yonko probably started after the dawn of the Great Pirate Era. In other words, after Roger's death. After all, the reason the seas became flooded with pirates in the first place was Roger's last words. "My treasure, huh? If you want it, you can have it. Search for it. I left everything the world has to offer there." That one line lit the spark, and people all over the world set out to sea, chasing after the treasure known as One Piece. From there, pirates spread everywhere, especially the islands in the Grand Line. They must have suffered heavy damage from pirate attacks. At that point, there were simply too many pirates for the Marines to handle on their own. In that kind of era, the Yonko became really important. The Yonko aren't just the strongest of the strong, they also claimed territories across the Grand Line and had fleets of subordinate crews under their command. For islands outside the world government, the Marines offered no protection at all, and even some member nations still got ravaged by pirates. That's where the Yonko came in. They acted as a deterrent, keeping other pirates in check and, in their own way, protecting ordinary people's daily lives. Take Fishman Island, for example. Less than 5 years after Roger's execution, swarms of pirates stormed the New World and tore the place apart, and the one who stepped in and saved it was Whitebeard. As these Yonko expanded their territories and gathered more subordinates, their influence grew to rival, or even surpass, that of entire nations. That's why they came to be called the Four Emperors, and why they became one of the pillars keeping the world's balance. And that's also why even the Marines couldn't easily lay a hand on them. By the way, the term Yonko, Four Emperors, isn't like the 7 warlords of the sea, which was a title officially given by the world government or the Marines. Even Garp explains in the Japanese version that they're simply called the Four Emperors by the world. In other words, Four Emperors is just a name people started using for the most powerful pirates. It's not like there's a specific set of rules or requirements you have to meet to become one. What really matters is influence. As Admiral Aramaki once put it, influence is a power you can't just wish yourself into. And we've seen that in action. Take Buggy, for example. He was recognized as an Yonko not because of sheer strength, but because of a chain of misunderstandings and circumstances that gave him a huge presence on the world stage. That shows us that being a pirate with truly global influence is one of the biggest reasons someone gets recognized as a Yonko. So, what about Luffy? Sure, he's strong enough to fight Kaido on equal terms, but his bounty is the same as Law and Kid's, 3 billion. And it's not like he had a bunch of islands under his direct control either. Even so, Luffy ended up being recognized as one of the Yonko. Because of the sheer weight of everything he and his crew have done up to this point, defeating 3 warlords and even one of the former emperors, punching a celestial dragon, storming into the world government's most important strongholds like Enies Lobby, Impel Down, and Marineford, causing massive incidents and then surviving every single time. On top of that, his Straw Hat Grand Fleet has been active all over the world, spreading his influence even further. And let's not forget his family ties. His father is with the Revolutionary Army, and his sworn brother was also tied to world-shaking events. All of that adds to the global impact surrounding Luffy. And when you think about it, Fishman Island and Wano are basically under his protection now, plus he's got allies like Dressrosa, the Mink tribe, and the giant warrior pirates who would all side with him if it came to a world-level conflict. Put it together, and Luffy's influence as an Yonko is every bit the real deal. All right, let's start by looking at the time before the Great Pirate Era really began. Right now, in the Elbaf arc, we're getting a flashback to Loki's past, and from what's shown there, it doesn't look like the idea of the 4 emperors even existed back in the days of Rocks or Roger. The Rocks pirates were based on Hachinosu, but we don't really see them holding other territories or acting as a deterrent against rival pirate crews. They were basically just a gathering of pirates chasing after profit, and if the chance came, aiming to seize the world. They weren't a unified organization with the mindset of controlling the seas or keeping other pirates in check. As for Roger's crew, there's no sign that they had territories either, or subordinate crews working under them. So, about 40 years ago, when the Rocks pirates dominated, it was more like they sat at the very top as the strongest crew, and the Roger pirates were barely managing to follow in their wake. On top of that, there was also the Kuja pirates, who had a different kind of influence on the world. So at that time, the 3 most influential crews were the Rocks pirates, the Roger pirates, and the Kuja pirates. But keep in mind, this was before Roger reached Laugh Tale. The treasure's true nature wasn't known yet, so there weren't nearly as many people willing to risk everything to become pirates. Aside from massive figures like Roger or Rocks, the Marines alone could more or less keep things under control. That's probably why back then, there wasn't a need for a system like the 4 emperors or the 7 warlords to maintain balance in the world. Now, since we usually follow Luffy's story, Roger naturally feels like this inspiring, almost heroic figure. He's Luffy's role model, after all, and his journey is shown as free and full of adventure. It's easy to think of Roger as a great guy. But the reality is, his actions triggered the spread of pirates across the world, and countless people lost their lives as a result. From the perspective of ordinary people living in the One Piece world, Roger was honestly a terrifying man. Looking at today's age of rampant piracy, it really drives home just how dangerous his legacy was. By the way, after the fall of the Rocks pirates, the situation shifted again. Even though the term 4 emperors didn't exist yet, there were already groups of pirates who held similar levels of power. In fact, Volume 2 of Novel Ace mentions that during the so-called Zero Generation, Roger, Whitebeard, Shiki, and Big Mom were the ones who dominated the New World. So basically, from around 38 years ago, when the Rocks pirates collapsed, up until 24 years ago, for about 14 years straight, those four crews were locked in a constant struggle for supremacy. All right, let's move on to the balance of power after Roger's execution. Roger had achieved the title of Pirate King, but of course he was put to death afterward. Around that same time, Golden Lion Shiki also made his move. Just a week before Roger's execution, he launched a solo assault on Marineford. But there, he was subdued by Sengoku and Garp, and ended up locked away in Impel Down, all the way down on level 6. So, out of the 4 great Zero-Generation pirates who had been competing for supremacy, 2 of them fell in the span of a single week. That left Whitebeard and Big Mom as the 2 most powerful pirates recognized right after the start of the Great Pirate Era. And just to be clear again, the title 4 Emperors wasn't something the world government officially declared. It was simply the name people started using for the strongest 4 pirates in the world, so whether the idea of the 4 Emperors already existed right after Roger's death is still uncertain. That said, in the SBS of Volume 78, we learn that Crocodile actually joined the 7 warlords of the sea in his early 20s. Now, in Japanese, early 20s usually means between the ages of 20 and 24. So that means the warlord system already existed at least 22 years ago, when Crocodile was about 24. And since the warlords were created specifically to counterbalance the 4 emperors who dominated the Grand Line, it makes sense that the term Yonko must have already been in use around that same time. So basically, the 4 emperors and the 7 warlords as systems must have come into existence somewhere between Roger's execution 24 years ago and 22 years ago. In fact, the first time the phrase territory of a Yonko was used was when Whitebeard claimed Fishman Island as his territory. At the time, during the waves of the Great Pirate Era, the island was being constantly attacked and pillaged by pirates. Whitebeard stepped in, saved the island, and by placing it under his protection, the people of Fishman Island were finally able to live in peace under the deterrent power of his name. So, with Roger executed and Shiki captured by the Marines, it's pretty much certain that Whitebeard and Big Mom were recognized as the first 2 emperors. But then the question is, who were the other 2? Let's go through the possible candidates one by one. First up, Kaido. He's the obvious name that comes to mind. Just a year after Roger's execution, in other words, 23 years ago, Kaido fought a massive war against Moria in Ringo, in Wano Kuni. It's possible that Kaido's victory in that war was the turning point that led people to start recognizing him as one of the 4 emperors. After all, Moria was influential enough that he later became one of the 7 warlords, so defeating him back then would have pushed Kaido's reputation to a whole new level. From that point on, it makes sense that he could have been seen as a global threat, and that would put him as one of the original 4 emperors. The other possible name is Silver Axe, one of the former Rocks pirates. What's interesting is that even Marines who didn't know much about Rocks still seemed to know who Silver Axe was. That suggests he had a strong reputation in his own right. He was said to be a rival of Shiki, so it wouldn't be strange if he stepped into Shiki's place as one of the 4 most powerful pirates after Roger's death. And since he was originally a Gokudo, it's likely he was deeply tied to the underworld, making deals with shadowy organizations. And in the One Piece world, there are still a lot of underground groups that haven't even been revealed to us yet. If Silver Axe really was controlling or influencing some of those networks, then it's not hard to imagine that he had enough power to be considered one of the 4 emperors back then. The next 4 emperor candidate to look at is Ouchoku. Ouchoku was apparently the boss of Hachinosu until he was finally taken down through the combined efforts of Blackbeard, Law, and Kobe. That alone shows how much influence he held. On top of that, his title was the Pirate Cult Leader, which makes it sound like he might have had a sort of fanatic following, gathering a huge number of supporters, almost like a religious movement. By the way, I've mentioned before that I think there was a traitor within the Rocks Pirates, and that traitor might have been Ouchoku. I talked about this in a video on the Dusk Owners channel. In the comments on that video, a lot of people said Silver Axe was the traitor, but personally, I put my bet on Ouchoku. And of course, I've got my reasons for that. Here's my theory. I think Ouchoku struck a deal with the world government. The condition was that he would secretly leak detailed information about Hachinosu and the Rocks Pirates. And in return, once the government used that intel to take down the Rocks crew, they would support him as the new boss of Hachinosu, and as long as he ruled there, they'd agree not to invade. Now, Hachinosu was such a dangerous place, packed with pirates, that even Garp himself hesitated to mess with it. But once Rocks fell, we know Kaido, Big Mom, Whitebeard, and Shiki all left the island. That means the overall strength of Hachinosu must have dropped significantly. If the world government really wanted to, they could have sent an admiral or launched a Buster Call level force and taken control. The fact that they didn't makes me think it was because of this secret deal with Ouchoku. After the Rocks Pirates collapsed at God Valley 38 years ago, it seems Ouchoku ruled Hachinosu right up until the Rocky Port incident, acting as the boss of Pirate Island. That alone makes it pretty believable. And during the Rocky Port incident, ships carrying high-ranking figures from a certain nation, along with huge passenger ships and smuggling vessels, were all going in and out of Hachinosu. That suggests the world government may have been using its member nations as intermediaries to secretly keep dealings going with Ouchoku and the pirates under him. And another interesting point is that the Marine who helped Blackbeard take down Ouchoku was Kobe. Kobe is a member of SWORD, a unit that can ignore the world government's orders and act freely. So even if there really was some kind of treaty between Ouchoku and the government, that wouldn't matter to Kobe. If he thought taking down a pirate was necessary to save civilians, he had the freedom to act. For all these reasons, I believe the chances are very high that Ouchoku was actually the traitor within the Rocks Pirates. Then there's Loki. The chances are lower, but it's not impossible that Loki was once recognized as one of the 4 emperors. Right now, he has what's called a special bounty set by the world government, 2.6 billion. That's actually higher than Blackbeard's bounty was when he first became in Yonko, which was about 2.247 billion. Of course, bounty alone doesn't tell the whole story, but Loki is also the Prince of Elbaf, which means he had the ability to command a certain number of soldiers. And in recent story developments, the Giants have been highlighted as an extremely important force, so much so that the world government is trying to recruit them in preparation for the massive war that's coming. That suggests Loki's influence as a giant prince could have been enough to earn him recognition as an emperor at some point. Jinbei even knew about him, though very few characters have actually mentioned Loki, which leaves a lot of mystery around him. One last detail worth mentioning is that 6 years ago, Loki fought Shanks, and in the end, Shanks captured him. And since we know Shanks officially became an emperor 6 years ago, it's possible that Shanks actually took Loki's spot as one of the Yonko. So far, we've gone through 4 possible candidates, but personally, I think the very first pirates to be called the Yonko were Whitebeard, Big Mom, Silver Axe, and Kaido. Of course, when it comes to Silver Axe, the information is pretty limited, so there's still plenty of room for debate. But the fact that, among all the Rocks pirates who are usually just listed off in a row, Silver Axe alone got singled out and given his own big panel, and the fact that he was a rival of Shiki, one of the strongest of the Zero generation, makes me believe he really could have been one of the original Yonko. Here's how I imagine it played out. Right after the Great Pirate Era began, 24 years ago, there wasn't yet an official title of Yonko. But as more and more pirates took to the seas inspired by Roger's final words, a few of the most powerful ones naturally came to hold influence as deterrents to the rest. Whitebeard and Big Mom, survivors of the Zero generation, along with Silver Axe, became recognized as the strongest in the world. Then, a year later, 23 years ago, Kaido defeated Moria in Wano's Ringo region, gained even more strength, and joined their ranks. From there, the idea of these four being the Yonko gradually spread throughout the world. In response, the world government scrambled to create the Seven Warlord system, and Crocodile ended up joining in his early 20s. Meanwhile, about 14 years ago in Elbaf, there was the Herald murder case, with Loki blamed as the culprit. After that, it seems Loki left Elbaf and went on a rampage across the seas. It's even possible that during that time he was considered one of the Yonko himself. About 6 years ago, Shanks stepped in among the strongest 4 pirates of that time. In fact, it's said that 6 years ago, Shanks captured Loki and brought him back to Elbaf. That victory over Loki was probably one of the biggest reasons he came to be recognized as one of the Yonko. Recently, little by little, we've been getting glimpses into Shanks's past, but there are still huge gaps left in his story. I've actually put together a detailed timeline of Shanks on my Patreon, so if you're curious, you can check that out. I'll make it available for a short time. Personally, the part of his chronology that interests me the most is what he was doing after leaving Fuchsia Village. In other words, from 12 years ago when he parted ways with Luffy, up until 6 years ago when he finally became an emperor. That entire period is still a complete mystery. But there are a few rare hints scattered in the story, so let's go over them. First off, there's a line where Shanks tells Luffy at Makino's bar about his next plans. He says, "After 2 or 3 more voyages, I'm planning to leave this village and head far north." Now, considering that the Goa Kingdom is already located fairly far north on the Blue Planet, it makes me wonder, was his real destination the North Pole? In fact, we know that Buggy and Shanks used to constantly argue about whether the North Pole or the South Pole was the real one. At one point, someone who seems to be Rayleigh even told them, "If you want to know which is colder, just go and see for yourselves." So it's pretty fun to imagine that Shanks might have actually gone to check it out. And when you think of the North Pole, what comes to mind is the land of ice. Moria himself once went there, and when he found the corpse of Oars, he said it sent chills down his spine. Oars was said to have conquered all kinds of nations, dragging them back to his own land to build what became known as a kingdom of villains. But in the end, according to Chopper, he froze to death after wandering through the icy land completely naked. Shanks once mentioned that there were still things he wanted to learn in Elbaf, but maybe what he really wanted to investigate was Oars, and if that's the case, then heading to the icy land where Oars met his end doesn't sound far-fetched at all. By the way, do you know what lies north of the Goa Kingdom? Let's take a look at Oda Sensei's original draft of the Blue Planet map. It's drawn in the Mercator projection, so it's a little tricky to read. But if you head north from the Goa Kingdom toward the North Pole, the island that sits in between is Yotsuba Island. Yotsuba in Japanese means a 4-leaf clover, and if it only has 3 leaves, it's called a shamrock. Shamrock has appeared in Elbaf, sent by the world government to bring the giants under their control, and he even came face to face with Loki, the descendant of the ancient giants. So if Shanks really did set out toward the land of ice, where the ancient giant oars once lay, then it's almost like fate, that both brothers, Shanks and Shamrock, would end up tied to the legacy of the ancient giants. And there's another hint about Shanks's movements, this time from the words of Elder Mars. Red hair can be dangerous if he's allowed to rampage, but he's not the kind of man who tries to shape the world on his own. The part that really stands out here is that phrase, Shanks rampaging in the past, because when we think of Shanks today, that doesn't really fit. Nowadays, he's calm and deliberate in almost everything he does. He stopped Kaido from heading to Marineford during the Paramount War, and he stepped in between the Marines and Whitebeard's crew to bring the war to an end. From that image, it's hard to picture him ever rampaging. Which makes me think, there must have been some incident in those 6 missing years where Shanks really did go wild. That might even connect to his clash with Loki. And remember, Mars is also the one who contacted Harold, the very person who pushed the condition that to join the world government, he had to kill Rox. Mars has long been the one managing delicate ties with Elbaf, so it's not far-fetched to think he was involved when Shanks went up against Loki as well. So when Mars makes a statement about seeing Shanks rampage, it actually lines up perfectly with that idea.